All right. Well, with that, we're going to introduce Kim Anderson, who will talk about Title IX. So please give her a round of applause.
So I have a lot to tell you about today, so I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. But please know that my office is, we're located in the French Administration Building. You can stop by, give us a call anytime you have questions or just want to talk with us about some concerns. We are happy to hear from you. So I'm going to cover a lot, like I said. Mostly I will be talking about Title IX as it pertains to institutions. And as you may or may not know, Title IX relates to sexual discrimination on campuses. And traditionally, we talked about it in the form of athletics and kind of equal opportunity to access athletics for men and women. But in recent years, we've also started addressing it as sex and gender-based violence, which creates a barrier to accessing education. And so with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about again, sex and gender-based violence. And so I just, like to remind everybody that, individuals in this audience may find these topics somewhat distressing. And I ask that you, to the extent that you're comfortable, be supportive for individuals who may seem to appear distressed. Of course, only if they're asking for your support. Don't force that on them. But also know that there are resources available on campus and in the local community to everyone as students. But those include Alternatives to Violence of the Palouse is our local advocacy group. They are available 24 hours, and you can reach them at this number here for the 24-hour crisis line and or on their website. And then we also have counseling and psychological services on campus, as well as health and wellness services on campus. So kind of 4 major policies, really 2 that we're most focused on, but I want you to kind of know about the 4 policies that may be relevant to any form of sex and gender-based violence on campus. And so, of course, first is the WSU policy prohibiting discrimination, sexual harassment, and sexual misconduct. That's Executive Policy 15, so that's a policy that applies to everyone on campus. Students, faculty, staff, even visitors to campus can be subject to an investigation under this policy. So that's my office. The Office for Equal Opportunity is directly charged with looking into matters that implicate that policy. Often conduct, when we're interacting with students, often conduct also implicates the standards of conduct for students, which apply whether you're an undergrad or graduate student. I think you'll be hearing from the Director of Student Conduct later today. But to the extent when we're talking about sex and gender-based violence, these 2 policies cross-reference each other with the idea of streamlining. So we may not have a definition. If the definition is in one policy, it's not going to be in the other policy. It's going to send you back to the other policy. And then additional policies which are in the purview of human resource services but may implicate concerns for you students. This policy on faculty, student, and supervisor-subordinate relationships. So that's talking about essentially relationships between a student and their advisor, or a TA and a student in their class, and so that is relevant for you kind of from both perspectives. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just kind of want you to be aware of these policies. And then there's also a policy on workplace violence and bullying within, again, the purview of human resource services. So just know that those are there. I'm not going to cover those in great detail, but if you have concerns you think may implicate those, I encourage you to look them up. You can also contact my office, and we're happy to chat with you about those. So under WSU policy, discrimination is prohibited on the basis of many protected classes, and I'm not going to read through them because, again, we have limited time here. But every person in this room is a member of multiple protected classes. So you are all protected by this policy. You're also all governed by this policy. We ask that you engage with respect towards your fellow classmates and towards individuals that you may come into contact with as undergraduate students, et cetera. So we want you to know that our goal at WSU is to have an open environment for everyone, where everyone can feel safe and pursue their education. So just quickly overview here. Again, I'm talking specifically about sex and gender-based violence, but WSU policy prohibits discrimination on the basis, again, of all of those protected classes. And so we want you to know that my office has a broader focus than just Title IX. So I am the director of the Office for Equal Opportunity. I'm also the ADA coordinator, or the Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator. So any concerns that implicate those, you can contact us with questions as well. Just broadly to describe discrimination is behavior. Prejudice is different from discrimination. It's an attitude. People are allowed to have prejudices. People can be bigoted. It's when their conduct actually impacts other people on the basis of those prejudices that the policy comes into play. So as a higher education institution, we're very clear that free speech is important, and we want to protect that to the extent possible, but there are levels of speech that can move into the area of discrimination. So we look at kind of 3 different categories of discrimination. They include disparate treatment, which is generally involving intent to discriminate against someone. Disparate or adverse impact doesn't require necessarily that someone knows or even intends to discriminate against someone, but their biases create a situation where someone in a protected class is experiencing a different level of access or participation in a situation. And then, of course, harassment. Most of the sex and gender-based violence falls under the category of harassment, in that it's a form of discrimination that sort of a pattern of conduct that unreasonably interferes with an individual's work or education. So this can be verbal, written, or physical. And the standard when we're looking at harassment is the conduct sufficiently severe, persistent, or pervasive? That's an important standard. Sometimes individuals can engage in inappropriate conduct that doesn't rise to the level of a violation of policy, but their conduct can be inappropriate and unprofessional, but it may not violate policy. So with that, then we look at sexual harassment, which is a form of discrimination on the basis of someone's sex or gender. And this is a fairly broad category. As I said before, it covers verbal conduct as well as physical conduct. So comments of a sexual nature, sexually explicit statements or jokes, quid pro quo harassment. It was sort of a very general example of quid pro quo harassment would be, if you go on a date with me, I will give you a better grade on this exam. So it's this for that, an exchange of something, some benefit for some sort of sexual interaction. Typically, that's not that overt. It's usually more of kind of an implied, if a faculty member is engaging with a student and frequently inviting them out to coffee and then invites them home and says, this could be really beneficial. I think these meetings are really good for you because I, am interested in creating a better grading situation for you. Maybe something more implied, less overt. And so we want you to know that of course is inappropriate, and you could contact us if that occurs. But also beware that your role, if you assume a role as a teaching assistant or in any sort of teaching capacity, you may have that authority over the other individual, and you want to be careful how your interactions are perceived as well. And then, of course, we also cover harassment based on a person's nonconformity with sex or gender stereotypes. So if an individual is targeting someone because they don't think they act feminine enough, or they don't dress feminine enough, or if in fact they identify as male but this person thinks they should identify as female, all of that is covered as a form of sexual harassment. On that, I just noted that our Gender Identity Center is having a welcome social today from 12 to 3, and they're just in Cub 401, so very close to here. So you could pop by there if you have an interest in learning more about the support and resources available on campus. So sex and gender-based violence is a form of sexual harassment, and which is all, of course, a form of discrimination. So it includes, but is not limited to, non-consensual sexual contact, sexual exploitation, which is a broad category, but generally we see allegations of say, voyeurism, viewing someone at a time or a place where they have an expectation of privacy. We've seen this in cases in residence halls with someone trying to view someone while they're in the shower or something. And so, again, we will pursue and investigate those concerns to the extent possible. Domestic violence and dating violence, also referred to as intimate partner violence. Again, something that occurs on campus and in our community. And so we want you to know that there are resources to respond and support students who are experiencing this, but also to address and prevent the behavior from continuing. And also stalking, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of these in a moment. But again, when we're looking at this conduct, we're still looking at whether or not the conduct was sufficiently severe, persistent, or pervasive to rise to the level of sexual harassment. Of course, with many of these concerns, one instance, if we find that it occurred, is going to be sufficiently severe to violate the policy. So we do a lot of training about this for undergraduate students when they're first coming into school. They're all participating in live sessions during the summer where they have a brief introduction to what consent looks like, what healthy relationships look like. But all of those can be available to you too as graduate students. They're also currently going through what we call an introduction to our Green Dot program, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that's a bystander intervention program for preventing sex and gender-based violence on our campuses. And again, available to all of you, and I encourage you to look into participating in one of those trainings. And there are also opportunities for people to become trainers within that program, and a particularly good opportunity for graduate students with an interest in that area. So when we talk about sexual contact, WSU has what we call an affirmative consent policy. So it requires that an individual be aware of what they're consenting to and clearly communicate that they are consenting to the conduct. We look at, they have to have the mental capacity to consent. So they have to know who, what, where, when, why, and how. So if someone is intoxicated or incapacitated as a result of consuming alcohol, they can't give consent. That's not to say that a person who's had one beer and is perfectly aware of their surroundings and their situations can't consent. It's someone who is incapacitated. But I will say that we do a rather large number of cases involving alcohol-facilitated sexual assaults. And that is not, while most of the cases do involve freshmen, it's not, we've also seen cases involving graduate students. So just want you to know that we're working to prevent this from occurring, but we also have a lot of resources in place to support if it does. So kind of an interesting comic here. I'm not going to take you there because it's kind of lengthy, but it's essentially depicting consent in everyday situations. And if you just Google comic about consent, there's a couple of them that pop up and they're pretty entertaining. Some of them have some swear words, which is also why I didn't include them here today. But I encourage you to check those out because it kind of puts it in perspective. So again, when we talked about sexual exploitation, stalking, and relationship violence, I'm not going to go into great detail about these, but know that this conduct is prohibited, and of course, if you experience it, that we're here to support. This is also important for you to be familiar with these policies, though, because many of you will at some point in your academic career be working as TAs or as teachers for courses, and you as employees of the institution have reporting obligations and may and actually frequently our student employees are the first point of contact when someone experiences some form of sex and gender-based violence. Often they will look to someone they see as closer to a peer or someone they're interacting with on a regular basis and share that. And we want you to know that you are required to report that to the university so that we can ensure that support and resources are deployed to the extent possible for this person. Why these issues are important on our campuses? Of course, you will probably become, if not already, be very familiar with the kind of interpretation of statistics, and we've seen a lot of different statistics related to this, and the numbers vary greatly, but consistently they say that it's an outrageous number of people who are experiencing sexual assault both men and women who are experiencing this while they're on campuses. And I can tell you, I have seen this firsthand where someone experiences this conduct and they no longer feel like they want to be on our campus and they want to leave. They don't feel supported, and we're losing students to these issues. And that to me is a terrible thing. And we want to create an environment where people are supported. We want to create an environment where this isn't occurring. But knowing that it currently is, we have lots of resources in place to address it, and we want people to feel supported and know that they can share those concerns with us. Additionally, very high numbers of individuals experiencing intimate partner violence before the age of 25. So again, we have a very high concentration of people under the age of 25 in a small community. And again, you can know that it's a high number of people who have experienced some form of intimate partner violence. Also, very high numbers of stalking victims under the age of 25. So WSU will address student allegations of sexual harassment regardless of where the conduct occurred. So if it occurred off campus, if it occurred while they're studying abroad, we're still going to try to address it to the extent possible. Our processes are separate and distinct from the criminal process and can be pursued simultaneously. So if someone experiences some form of sex and gender-based violence and wants to report that to the university, they're not required to report that to the police. We will respect their wishes as it pertains to that. There's some very limited situations where we might be required to report to the police if there's an ongoing safety concern. But otherwise, our goal is to empower people to make decisions about what processes they want to participate in. Again, no one is ever required to participate in our process either. Again, though, there are some limited circumstances where we may be required to pursue an investigation to address safety on campus. But to the extent possible, we're looking at empowering individuals to make those decisions for themselves. And our goal is just to make sure they know about resources available. So then coming back to this employee reporting obligations. So currently all WSU employees, including student employees, so that's TAs, even RAs, and even if you're working in a capacity where you're supervising students but it's outside of your student context, you may have an obligation to report to the university and to me as the Title IX coordinator. There are some exceptions, so of course employees who are statutorily barred, so employees who are working in a counseling context or a medical care context, of course, are protected and privileged. We also have extended that to employees who are providing preventative education training, so employees within our violence prevention office. But otherwise, unless designated as a confidential resource, WSU employees are required to report and cannot guarantee confidentiality. So we encourage you to be aware of that, be upfront about that with students who are sharing with you, but also to know that for your own benefit. And this is not in any way with a goal of forcing people to participate in a process or not. It's solely that so we can ensure that they have access to resources if they need them. And again, employees should not attempt to investigate or assess the complaints before reporting it to my office. So there's a lot of training available on campus. I kind of talked a little bit already about the Green Dot training, which is, again, a bystander intervention program to prevent violence on campuses. You can attend fairly regularly scheduled trainings, but you can also request a specific training. Same thing with the Ally training, which is offered through our Gender Identity Expression and Sexual Orientation Resource Center, GSORC, which is much easier to say. And again, regularly scheduled trainings, but you can also request those. Ally training is, I think, very valuable, especially, again, if you end up in a teaching role, to recognize, to learn about how to support people who identify as LGBTQ or who just are somewhat fluid in their sex or gender identity, and how to support individuals. My office recently participated in the Ally training. I guess it's been a while now, but found it very helpful, even thinking about how we address individuals. Assigning someone a Ms. or a Mr., it's really not necessary, and we can let the individual identify where they want. And for us to try to place them into a specific box is problematic. So we try to be as gender neutral in all of our interactions with people. And something, again, for teachers or TAs when they're engaging with students, to be sensitive to that, because that can create at least a perceived barrier for students who may not fit right in what we call those special boxes. Training, my office again offers quite a few trainings where anytime anybody wants directed training, we're happy to show up and provide that in person. We're also offering a number of online trainings, including a training for graduate students who are working as TAs. I encourage you, if you are going to be a TA or working with students, to take this training. And what you see here on this, this little image that's posted here, this is the end of the training after you've taken a short quiz about the information, and there's an option to print the results. If you click print results and type in your name, it will print a certificate for you. I encourage you to print that and provide that to the faculty that you're working with, or to your supervisors if you're working with students. Good to have on hand. We're also looking at requiring this training in the future. At present, it's voluntary, but again, I encourage you to do that. We also have some sample syllabus language. You all may not be putting this into your syllabi right away, but something that's there and available. Also, it just briefly discusses the university's response to sex and gender-based violence, and clarifies your reporting obligations. And so it's something, if you wanted to print that out and have that available in your office, you could do that as well. So to talk a little bit about what our process looks like if somebody does experience sex and gender-based violence. Again, I keep mentioning that we have a lot of support services available for students. Confidential resources, some of those I discussed already. I brought a package of handouts, which will be in the back of the room. If you are interested in grabbing that, it's a list of resources and a brief explanation of our conduct process. Those are also available on our website. You can click and print those at will and share them with people. I often encourage faculty to have them on hand. If a student does come to them with a concern, they can present them with this handout. It'll explain the various resources and has contact information for all of those. But again, confidential resources include counseling and psychological services, alternatives to violence of the police, our health and wellness center on campus, but also Pullman Regional Hospital. And again, very accessible. I'll go and say a little bit more about alternatives to violence of the police, or ATVP. They, again, 24-hour phone number, you can contact them. They have individuals on campus in our violence prevention office, and they will come to you if you're even at your home and you just want someone to come meet and speak with you. They will meet students and support them in any way possible. So additional resources include the Dean of Students office on campus, which can help in coordinating resources, including sort of academic or residential arrangements. The graduate school is also a great resource if we're looking into concerns, either involving student versus student or student and faculty member. We can work with the graduate school to support students throughout that process. And then, of course, the Office of Student Conduct is the office with disciplinary responsibility for student conduct. So one thing that we want to be clear is that we, when we talk about not wanting individuals to engage in their own investigation, it's because I recognize that students who have experienced forms of sex and gender-based violence often are experiencing something very traumatic that can impact them lifelong, but also very extremely in the specific instance. And so our investigators are trained to conduct what we call trauma-informed interviews and to deploy resources to support students. And so when we're asking you to refer cases to us or to refer students to us if they've experienced this, it's because we know that there's a great potential to do harm if you ask the wrong question or you say the wrong thing, even if it's not intentional, can harm an individual who's been traumatized. And so we want, again, you to understand that when students are coming to us, or when you're calling us and telling us that a student has reported something to you, that it's because, we require that because we want to be able to provide the appropriate level of support for students. If students decide to participate in an investigation, we do have many steps that we can take to really assure the student's safety during the investigation. We can make arrangements again for housing and safety concerns, can look at changing class and work schedules, and of course, you know, in the situation where a student doesn't want to be on campus, of course our goal is to keep them on campus, but again, to let them make the decisions about what's best for themselves. We can support them in course withdrawals, et cetera. We call these interim measures when we're conducting an investigation, and I really want to emphasize that these are not sanctions. These are in place to protect really both parties in the investigation and to make sure that we're supporting all students. So all of these resources are available for all students who are participating in the process. So if we engage in an investigation into sex and gender-based violence, this is a neutral process. So there's no predetermined outcome. It's really important to us as investigators that the process remain neutral because that holds the integrity of the process. And so, again, with that, resources are available to any and all participants, including witnesses. And again, my office is solely an investigative office. Any violations of the policy would be referred to the Office of Student Conduct to address sanctions, or to Human Resource Services, or to the relevant departments to address response to violations. So, retaliation, strictly prohibited. Even if we don't open an investigation, if an individual talks with us and somebody subjects them to retaliation as a result of that, that would be a separate and distinct policy violation. We work very carefully to coordinate response from the university, but also first to ensure that students are supported and to the extent possible insulated from any form of retaliation or interference in an investigation before we open an investigation. So if as a student you experience something inappropriate from, say, your faculty advisor, we want you to know that we're going to work with you to minimize any impact on you and to have support available. Again, we provide discrimination, sexual harassment prevention training to all of our faculty and staff. It's required. So our goal is to prevent this from happening. But again, just to know that if it does happen, there are resources available for you. Go back quickly to Executive Policy 28, which is the policy on faculty, student, and supervisor subordinate relationships. It's a lengthy title, but it essentially means, you know, relationships between individuals where there is a power imbalance. So if, you know, you are supervising an individual, you shouldn't be in a relationship with them. There may be a question as to whether or not they felt free to enter or exit that relationship. And so if, for some reason, you must enter a relationship with someone in one of the classes you teach or someone that you supervise, you need to report that to your supervisor right away. But also know that, again, if you enter into a relationship with someone who supervises you, they should also be reporting that and removing that power imbalance. Our goal is to make sure that students have equal power in any relationship and are supported. So those should be reported to HRS. The response would not necessarily be, the only time that there would be a disciplinary response is if it wasn't properly reported or properly handled. And so if you keep it secret, that can be a problem. But if it's reported, then we'll just look at altering reporting lines and removing that imbalance of power. Now, with that being said, I include this in our training because, again, a lot of times those relationships end up being, you know, when we find the relationship ends, it turns out that maybe one individual didn't feel as free to exit the relationship as the other. And so I highly encourage you to think very carefully before entering into any such relationship, and certainly we would discourage faculty from engaging in that because of that potential imbalance of power. So we have Title IX committee on campus. We also have liaisons, Title IX liaisons on each of our urban campuses, but our Pullman campus involves myself and then Melinda Husky, who's the interim vice president for student affairs and also the dean of students. as well as Ann McCoy, Associate Director of Athletics. So if you have concerns, you can contact any of those individuals to share them and or to ask questions. And I have 1 minute left, I think. So does anybody have any questions? It's a lot of information. Again, there will be handouts on the back table for you if you're interested. You can also print those off of our website. It's just oeo.wsu.edu. Again, don't hesitate to contact us if you have questions or concerns. We have anonymous online reporting forms. You can also just walk into the office and file a complaint, or contact us if you're interested in learning more about some training opportunities.